The revolving glass doors of Heritage First Bank were still trembling when David Coleman's contempt-filled shout tore through the luxurious air. "I am saying this one last time. Pick up those papers and get out of my bank before security drags you out." The words were sharp as a freshly honed blade, striking the calm face of Evan Marshall, the man standing in the center of the lobby with an almost unsettling composure. More than 20 pairs of eyes swung toward him, not with the respect granted to a businessman, but with the suspicion and disdain reserved for someone who was seen as not belonging. Yet those very eyes, in just a few minutes, would witness the biggest reversal of their lives. Evan bent down, not to pick up the papers thrown onto the floor, but to unlock the walnut-colored briefcase, a briefcase that had once sat on the conference tables of presidents, governors, and some of the most powerful corporations in America. When he pulled out the sealed envelope, the lobby fell silent. No extra breaths, no stray movements. Even the sound of paper against his hand seemed to echo with a cold edge. $50 million. Evan said his voice, low yet resonant, each word striking the marble floor like a hammer was supposed to go to this bank today. The employees nearby froze for a split second, their forced smiles stiffening. A young teller placed a hand on her chest, as if she had just missed a heartbeat. An older security guard furrowed his brows, an uneasy feeling spreading inside him. But David Coleman, the man standing proudly before Evan, simply smirked the smirk of someone convinced he was absolutely right. "This is a first-class bank," David said, slowly his eyes flicking down at Evan's simple clothing. "We serve real clients, not people who look like you." The words flowed out with blind confidence, as if he had already sentenced a man solely based on skin color and clothing. Evan did not frown, did not get angry, did not flinch. He stood there with the envelope containing the $50 million investment in his hand, his gaze calm like a lake before a storm, a gaze that anyone perceptive enough would recognize as the composure of someone who knew exactly where the real power lay. But the people in the lobby were not perceptive. A man in a golf shirt whispered to his wife, "Probably a scam." A young banker shook his head, convinced this was just another troublesome customer. Only one person, James Lopez, a 27-year-old analyst standing behind the counter, felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked at Evan, the way he stood, the way he spoke, and especially the way he did not defend himself, even after being openly insulted. James had seen the name Evan Marshall in an internal report a few days earlier, a name that had startled him, a name he never thought he would see here looking like this. But David didn't recognize him. He didn't bother to. He did not want to. He grabbed the investment proposal from Evan's hand, skimmed it for a few seconds, then, to the horror of everyone watching, tore it in half. The ripping sound echoed like someone shredding their own fate. "You think you can fool us?" David snapped. $50 million! He let out a loud laugh. "Showing up in a Tesla and claiming you want to invest that kind of money? That's hilarious." That laugh was the spark. That moment was the matchstick for a quake no one in the lobby could possibly imagine. Evan lowered his gaze to the torn document, but he did not look at it with disappointment. He looked at it as if recording evidence. Then he lifted his head. His eyes, for the first time since he walked in, sharpened like a blade catching sunlight. His face was no longer calm. It had become cold, commanding, almost dangerous. A wave of invisible pressure rippled across the lobby, enough to make even the two security guards stand a little straighter. "Are you sure?" Evan asked softly. A simple question, but so quiet it sent shivers down a few spines. David laughed again, unaware he had just crossed a line he could never return from. I am very sure. Evan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a single number. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then someone picked up. Grace. He said, his eyes locked on David. Cancel the $50 million deal with Heritage First Bank immediately. The words were small, but in the silence of the marble lobby, they detonated like lightning in clear skies. Amanda, the receptionist who had looked down on Evan earlier, turned pale as paper. Another employee dropped his pen. David blinked rapidly, his confidence leaking away. W. What did you just say? Evan did not respond. He simply said into the phone, We are moving everything to Northwest United Bank. Call them. They will know who I am. When he hung up, the entire lobby fell dead silent. In that moment, every person in the room realized the same undeniable truth. Evan Marshall was not who they thought he was. He was not an ordinary customer. He was not a delusional dreamer. He was someone far bigger. James Lopez's voice trembled as he whispered, My God, it's really him. As for David, he stood, a frozen cold dread climbing up his spine. For the first time that morning, he felt something his 20 years in banking had never taught him. Fear. Evan looked at him gently, but with a razor's edge. It's unfortunate, David. You didn't just lose $50 million. He turned toward the door. You just lost something much bigger. And as he walked away, no one in the lobby dared breathe too loudly. No one dared speak, because everyone knew one thing. The storm had only just begun. The moment Evan Marshall's footsteps faded beyond the glass doors, the entire bank lobby cracked open into a suffocating silence, the kind of silence that felt as if an invisible hand had closed around the room and squeezed all the air out. David Coleman stood frozen, his face drained of color, his fingers still gripping the torn investment file, as if letting it go meant dropping his entire life with it. The other employees, the very same people who had looked at Evan moments earlier, with suspicion as if he were a scammer, now stood motionless, afraid to even blink for fear of missing the next moment that would define everything. A young security guard tilted his head and whispered to his partner, I feel like we just kicked out someone really important. It was the first sentence to break the silence. And it was so painfully accurate that the whole room seemed to shiver. James Lopez swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the door where Evan had disappeared. He could feel his heartbeat pounding like a drum against his ribs. He knew exactly who Evan was. He had read the internal reports, he had seen the name Marshall Tech Innovations listed under the bank's strategic clients. But David's actions this morning had thrown all of that truth away like trash. James took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of courage he had, and sprinted toward the executive offices. His heart hammered, each beat explosive, because he knew one thing. If he didn't act now, the disaster would grow beyond control. Meanwhile, in the main lobby, David desperately clung to the last scraps of his fading arrogance. Everyone calmed down. He stammered, his voice shaking. Even as he tried to force out the authority he usually carried, it was just a bluff. People like that don't have $50 million. But the twisted smile on his face fooled no one. Amanda looked at him, the way someone looks at a man who has just set fire to a building without realizing he is still standing inside it. Another employee whispered, voice trembling, So what if it was real? David snapped. Impossible. Nobody walks into my bank dressed like that and claims to invest $50 million. The moment those words left his mouth, the glass doors burst open again. But this time, it wasn't Evan returning. It was Richard Adams, chairman of Heritage First Bank, sprinting into the lobby with the urgency of a man who had just learned that a bomb was seconds away from detonating inside his office. His sunglasses were still on his suit, slightly crooked, his breaths shallow and sharp. His eyes swept the lobby like an X-ray scanner, searching for the epicenter of the explosion. "Where is Evan Marshall?" His voice boomed loud enough to stop the lobby cold. Every single person turned toward David. And in that instant, David knew he was finished. Not physically, but professionally. His career had died the moment he tore that investment document in half. Richard did not wait for an explanation. He saw the torn file on the floor. He saw David's pale face. He saw the panic in his employee's eyes. And within a fraction of a second, he understood everything. "Dear God," Richard whispered, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles twitched. "What have you done, David?" David tried to speak, but his voice crumbled into a desperate stutter. "I didn't know, I thought." You thought Richard spun around, his voice erupting like thunder and shaking the entire lobby. "You just threw out one of the most important strategic investors this bank has." The older security guard, Robert, instinctively stepped back. Amanda covered her mouth to keep from gasping. An elderly customer murmured, "Marshall Evan, Marshall Tech, 50 million real." Richard turned toward the conference room where Brian Whitmore sat, enjoying coffee and pastries, like some privileged guest, utterly unaware that a storm was rushing straight toward him. Everything happened within milliseconds. Some strange instinct made Richard stare at Brian, and something in his gut told him that something was very wrong with this man. At that exact moment, James Lopez rushed in, breathing hard. "Mr. Adams, I have extremely urgent information." Richard steadied himself and motioned for James to hand it over. After reading only the first few lines, the blood drained from his face. "When did you find this?" 3 days ago," Sir James said, his voice tight. "I tried to report it to Manager David twice, but he told me to mind my own business." Richard closed his eyes as if fighting the urge to roar. Then he opened them and strode toward the VIP room, his voice turning cold enough to cut steel. "Call the police." Immediately, the lobby erupted in gasps. Some thought they misheard him. Brian Whitmore looked up just as Richard entered. The confident smile on his face froze instantly. Richard pointed straight at him. "You are under investigation for interbank financial fraud. We have evidence you falsified reports, moved funds illegally, and attempted to obtain investment privileges from this bank without sufficient collateral." Brian forced a shaky laugh. This is a misunderstanding. I am a VIP client. You are a fraud." Richard cut him off, "And you will be in handcuffs within 2 minutes." At that precise second, the main doors slammed open. 2 police officers stepped inside. The air in the lobby thickened, ready to burst. Customers stepped back. Employees stared at one another, faces drained white. Brian jumped to his feet and tried to bolt toward the side exit, but he was caught instantly. He struggled, shouting, while Richard watched him being handcuffed, with the expression of a man who knew he had just escaped a bomb that one of his own employees had foolishly carried in and placed on his desk. And then, amid the chaos, Richard turned toward the doors where Evan had walked out moments earlier. In his eyes, something began to appear, something that 20 years in finance had never taught him to feel. Real fear. Fear of losing something greater than a deal. Losing their reputation. Losing the trust of the market. Losing the future of the entire bank. He whispered, almost like a confession, "Evan, you just took something from us that we may never get back." But what he didn't know was this. What happened next would be far worse, because Evan Marshall hadn't truly left the story. The storm he unleashed was only beginning to form its path, and it was about to sweep everything away. As the officers escorted Brian Whitmore out of the VIP room, each step he took left a dry, hollow echo across the marble floor, like the sound of nails being hammered into the coffin of his own career. But that was merely a spark compared to the tsunami that was about to crash down on Heritage First Bank. Because outside, where the Seattle sunlight glinted off the windows of his Tesla, Evan Marshall had stopped. He set his walnut leather briefcase on the roof of the car and drew in a long breath. The cold wind swept past, yet his eyes didn't waver. They were sharp, bright, and silent, like a blade poised to strike. Evan dialed Grace, the executive assistant who had been at his side for 12 years, the woman who had watched him grow from a young man building a startup in his garage into a CEO respected nationwide. She answered within a single ring, her voice tight with concern. "Sir, I cancelled the deal just as you instructed." "But what happened? Are you all right?" Evan leaned lightly against the car, his gaze fixed on the glass tower of the bank, the place where he had just been treated like he had no worth. "Grace," he said slowly, his voice low and rumbling like thunder rolling beneath the earth. Heritage First Bank just made the biggest mistake in their history. Silence filled the other end for a moment. "How big, sir?" "Big enough to cost them far more than 50 million. Grace didn't ask another question, because when Evan spoke like that, it meant a storm was about to be unleashed. Just minutes earlier, inside the bank lobby, Evan had maintained the composure of a man who understood exactly where true power lived, and that the moment of reckoning never arrived through shouting, but through silent decisions that the other side could never escape. Evan tapped his screen, opened his contacts, and selected a name that even the bank's chairman would fear. The National Council for Investment and Finance, a senior advisory group whose voices could influence the entire banking sector. The call rang twice before a middle-aged man answered. "Evan, I'm in a meeting with the Energy Division. Are you okay?" Evan closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, his tone turning razor-sharp. "I want to withdraw every company and personal account from Heritage First Bank, all of it. Within 24 hours, the line went silent. After a few seconds, the man's voice returned, lower, heavier. "Good Lord, are you sure about this? Your corporate account alone is at the top of their strategic client list. That amount is massive." Evan looked up at the tall windows behind which employees still moved about, unaware that disaster was hovering over their heads. "I'm sure," Evan replied. "That bank just did something you never do in this industry," the man asked. "Do you want me to contact Chairman Richard directly?" Evan let out a faint smile, not amused, not boastful. It was the smile of someone who knew his enemy was already digging their own grave. "No need. I want them to watch the collapse with their own eyes." When Evan ended the call, the sky above the bank was still clear, the sunlight still sparkling across the glass facade. But inside, the course of fate had already begun to shift. Back in the lobby, Richard Adams had just finished seeing the police off when a notification lit up on his smart watch. He glanced down. A message from the National Investment Council appeared. "Evan Marshall requests full withdrawal of all accounts. Priority processing required immediately." Richard felt as if someone had punched him square in the chest. He staggered, taking a step back, his fingers squeezing so tight his knuckles turned white. No, this can't be. Amanda saw his pale face and asked Mr. Adams what happened. Richard didn't answer. He looked around, his eyes filled with a panic so raw that even the employees felt it spreading through them. He saw the torn papers on the floor. He saw David. He saw the desperation in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed the scene. And when the truth pieced itself together, it cut straight through him. We lost everything. David rushed forward. Mr. Adams, I can explain. I thought he was a scam. Richard turned sharply. His eyes weren't angry. They were worse. They were the eyes of a man watching his empire collapse because of one fool. You have cost this bank more than you can comprehend, David. You tore the file of one of the largest investors on the West Coast, and now you just triggered the withdrawal of every account they hold. David's knees nearly buckled. His mouth opened and closed without sound. Richard didn't wait for him. He headed toward his office, each step heavier than the last, as if he carried the weight of a building splitting apart. But the tragedy didn't end there. The moment he reached his office, a barrage of emails flooded his inbox. Viral video circulating need verification, clients requesting account closures, media demanding immediate response, unusual stock sell-off detected. Richard clicked the attached video. Within the first 14 seconds, he knew Heritage First Bank was finished. Evan Marshall being treated like trash. David Coleman tearing the documents. Security surrounding Evan. And Evan's final line, cold, clear and sharp as a blade, I will never invest in a place that treats people like this. Richard clutched his desk and sank down. His hands shook uncontrollably. An employee ran in, face pale. Mr. Adams, the hashtag banking. While Black is trending top 3 nationwide. The video has over 2 million views in half an hour. Richard didn't respond. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down into the wide lobby where everything had begun. Cold sweat trickled down his temple. Finally, he whispered a verdict for himself and the entire bank. We never understood that some people don't need to raise their voice to bring down an empire. Outside, Evan started the car. He didn't need to look back. Heritage First Bank had destroyed itself. All he did was pull the ignition cord. And the real explosion. It was coming. And it would spare no one. Evan Marshall's Tesla slipped out of the parking lot with an almost eerie smoothness. But inside the heart of Heritage First Bank, the first fractures of an oncoming earthquake were already spreading like cracks across a glacier, about to split apart. Evan sat behind the wheel, his left hand gliding across the control screen, not to change the music or check the route, but to open the internal contact list for the network of investment funds, where his influence ran deep. Within seconds, his eyes turned cold, sharp metallic like steel tempered in ice. Outside, sunlight carved slanted lines along the road, but inside the car the air felt colder, simply because of the silence radiating from the man who was about to decide the fate of an entire bank. Evan Grace's voice returned through the speaker system. Do you want me to notify the entire Marshall Tech board? Evan stared ahead toward the bright stretch of highway. No, I'll handle that. He activated the microphone, his voice echoing through the cabin, steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of a verdict. To all senior leadership. Effective immediately, Heritage First Bank is removed from our list of strategic partners. Grace did not ask anything else. She knew that when Evan said words like these, there was no path back. Inside the bank, Richard Adams was drowning under the tidal wave, swelling across social media. The glow from the computer screens illuminated the deep worry lines carved across his face. His eyes, stretched tight enough to crack. Amanda rushed to him with printed alerts. Sir Adams, the premier client from the Los Angeles branch, just announced they're moving $12 million. And another client in New York wants to withdraw an entire portfolio worth nearly $40 million. Richard felt as if he had been slapped. He snatched the papers, scanning each line, like he was reading his own death sentence. This happened this fast. Amanda nodded, her voice shaking. "The internet is calling this the most expensive discrimination incident in the country. They're sharing the clip." She handed him her phone. On the screen, the video showed Evan, standing in the center of the lobby, calm but wounded, his voice clear as crystal. "I will not invest a single dollar in an institution that does not respect human beings." That sentence spread through the online world like an arrow slicing through the night. Thousands of comments poured in. "Boycott Heritage First Bank." "This is blatant racism." "The man is right. I'm pulling my money too." The entire finance industry needs to rethink how they treat black customers. Richard gasped for air, his heart pounding. He had never seen a video explode this quickly. Never. In 20 years of finance, through countless media crises, he knew instantly that this one was beyond containment. In the main lobby, David Coleman, once so smug and towering, now shrank into a wrinkled suit looking like a ghost. When he saw Richard emerge from the office, eyes red, David lunged forward and grabbed his sleeve. "Mr. Adams, I know I messed up. Please give me a chance to fix." Richard jerked his arm free, his glare sharp enough to cut. "You don't understand the situation, David. One mistake from you could drag this entire bank to the bottom." David broke into sobs. I didn't know who he was." "And that is the problem," Richard roared. "You didn't know, but you still judged him. You treated him like trash. You tore up a $50 million proposal like it was worthless." Amanda stood nearby, clutching her stack of documents, eyes glistening. "Mr. Adams, what do we do now?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He stood there in the center of the vast lobby, looking at employees wiping tears, customers quietly walking out, and the accusing stares all aimed at David. Then his gaze settled on James Lopez, standing near the printer with the anti-fraud report he had tried to submit, his hand still gripping it tightly. Richard walked toward him. "James," he said softly but firmly, "you tried to warn us." "I'm grateful." James lowered his head, voice trembling. "I just did the right thing." Richard placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "And you will be remembered for that." The moment Richard returned to his office, the internal conference line exploded with alerts. Department heads, branch managers, and financial directors piled into an emergency meeting. Richard appeared on camera, his face gaunt, his eyes filled with grim resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing the worst crisis in the history of this bank." A manager asked, "How many accounts have been withdrawn?" Mr. Adams, a staff member, answered, "Nearly $180 million, and rising every minute." Collective gasps rippled through the meeting like a wave. Richard knew he needed to say something powerful, something to salvage even a sliver of hope. But before he could speak, a notification flashed across the giant screen. Marshall Tech Innovations has officially removed Heritage First Bank from its Tier 1 partnership list. A young director whispered, "We're finished." Richard could not deny it. This was no longer an internal scandal. This was a wound straight through the bank's heart, a wound inflicted by one man, and only one man, Evan Marshall. Outside, Evan remained in his car. He had pulled over on the roadside, retrieving his laptop from the back seat. An email window popped up with the subject line, "Marshall, we stand with you." It was a message from the CEO of Northwest United Bank. Below it were emails from other banks. "We are ready to receive the $50 million investment whenever you are." Evan looked at them not with pride, but with a deep, quiet sorrow. He had never wanted to destroy a bank. He had never wanted to put thousands of employees at risk. But the insult had not been a small mistake. It had come from a system accustomed to judging people by skin color and clothing. He closed his eyes for a moment. In that brief silence, he remembered his mother waiting in line for an hour at a service counter, simply because she was a black woman. He remembered his father being questioned about his account, despite being an aerospace engineer. Evan opened his eyes again. There was no hesitation left. "Grace," he said, "contact the legal department. We need a public statement about leaving Heritage First Bank." "What kind of statement?" Sir Evan stared toward the tower in the distance, shaping each word slowly, purposefully. One they can never tear apart. And in that moment, Heritage First Bank lost far more than $50 million. They lost the trust of a man whose reputation alone could shake an entire market. But the most terrifying part was still ahead. Because the storm Evan had released had not yet reached its center. It had only touched the shore, and the real tsunami gathering behind him was preparing to sweep away an entire empire. Within 2 hours of Evan Marshall leaving the parking lot, the situation at Heritage First Bank was no longer an internal incident, no longer a small viral clip, but a full-blown media firestorm rolling across every platform, from Twitter to YouTube to national news broadcasts. Millions of viewers, hundreds of thousands of comments, breaking news updates every minute. Evan sat inside his temporary office in the downtown tower laptop, open in front of him, his phone buzzing non-stop with alerts from the PR team, strategic advisors, and national news outlets. On his screen, the logo of Global Financial Network appeared with a breaking headline: "Breaking news footage showing a CEO being discriminated against at Heritage First Bank is igniting social media." The anchor spoke solemnly. According to sources, the man in the video is Evan Marshall, founder of Marshall Tech Innovations, with an estimated net worth of nearly $4 billion. Mr. Marshall has announced a complete severance of ties with Heritage First Bank after being insulted by bank management and watching his $50 million investment file being torn in half. Evan watched without smiling, without nodding, without even a hint of satisfaction. Every time his own image appeared on the screen, standing in that lobby facing the humiliation he endured, he felt only the heavy weight settling deeper in his chest. Because he knew this truth, millions of people like him had endured far worse. But no one had cameras rolling. No one had a chance to stand in the light. He was simply one of the rare few who could force the entire country to confront the problem. And he understood clearly that responsibility weighed more than money, more than power, more than reputation. Meanwhile, inside Heritage First Bank's headquarters, Richard Adams was staring into the nightmare every leader fears most relentless media calls an endless stream of clients, withdrawing funds, a PR team drowning under the crisis, and an executive board fracturing into chaos. On the huge screen in the emergency meeting room, the bank's stock chart plummeted almost in a vertical line. "We have lost 8%. In 1 hour," a director reported, voice cracking. "And we risk losing another 10% by the end of the day if we don't stabilize the market with a statement. They're calling this the $50 million blow," someone else said, gripping a stack of documents so tightly it bent. "No, it's worse than 50 million. Richard rasped his shaking hands, bracing against the table. "We are looking at losses in the billions. In the corner of the room, David Coleman sat, collapsed in his chair, soaked in sweat, his hands gripping his arm so hard his nails dug into the skin. He didn't dare look at anyone. Every whisper, every accusing glance from his colleagues stabbed into him like needles. He had become the symbol of disaster. A female risk management director shot to her feet. "Mr. Adams, we need an official apology. Immediately. We have to contact Mr. Marshall. We have to beg him for a chance to fix this." The entire room turned to Richard, waiting. But before he could respond, the door swung open. A communications staffer rushed in, pale as chalk. "Mr. Adams, we just discovered another video." The room froze. "What video?" "Security camera footage." At that, David jolted upright, shaking. No, it can't. I only—" The staffer opened a laptop and played the clip on the large monitor. It was David tearing the $50 million file apart and ordering security to force Evan out. There was no audio, but none was needed. The image alone told the entire story. Someone in the room sucked in a sharp breath as the footage replayed. The moment the file ripped slowed down, almost cruelly. David staggered backward, tripping over a chair and falling, his face drained of all color. Someone whispered, "He's finished." Another added, "Not just him. All of us." Richard slammed his hand onto the table. "Turn that off. Now." But no one had time. A notification blinked onto the secondary screen. Camera footage leaked, trending #1. The security camera video had already escaped into the world. The entire planet was watching. Richard grabbed his head and collapsed into his chair, as if every ounce of strength had been ripped from his body. "Dear God," he whispered, "we have no chance left." At Evan's office, Grace burst through the door, her face grave. "Evan," the security camera footage leaked. It's spreading faster than the first video. Evan looked up. "How fast?" Grace swallowed. 7 million views in 15 minutes. Evan said nothing. No triumphant smile, no thrill of victory. Only the heavy weight of a burden he never wanted. "They will try to reach you," Grace added. "They will beg for forgiveness." Evan closed his laptop and stood. He looked out the window at the city of Seattle, still moving, as if nothing had happened, cars passing by, people walking completely unaware that a massive bank was dying right before their eyes. He whispered to himself, "Forgiveness doesn't fix a system." Grace studied him for a long moment. "So what will you do next?" Evan turned, his eyes flashing like a blade catching light. "I don't need to do anything. They are destroying themselves." And at that exact moment, Evan's phone rang. On the screen appeared the name he fully expected to see. Richard Adams. Evan stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he let it ring and ring until it stopped. For the first time in his life, the chairman of a major bank was the one whose call went unanswered. On the other side, in the chaotic boardroom when Richard saw the call was declined, he sank into his chair. The entire room fell silent. A cold truth settled over everyone. They no longer had the right to ask for forgiveness. Because the storm had not merely arrived, it was growing larger by the second. And Heritage First Bank was sinking. Red alert notifications from the bank's internal risk monitoring system exploded across Richard Adams's screen, like the wailing sirens of a city descending into chaos. Each warning message appeared like a hammer, striking the final slabs of concrete that once held Heritage First Bank together. Mass account withdrawals reported at 17 branches. 105 transactions cancelled within 10 minutes. Analysis department confirms regional liquidity risk imminent. Every line carved a deeper wound into Richard's pride. He had always believed in financial ethics, believed a bank could be a safe place for everyone. But today that place had turned into a self-destructing machine. Branch directors called non-stop, their voices trembling with panic. Some reported dozens of furious, high-value clients slamming their fists on desks. Others said their employees were being verbally attacked because customers assumed they were part of the discriminatory behavior. A branch in Portland had to shut down temporarily because the line of customers withdrawing funds stretched out the door. Richard watched it all with hollow eyes, like a man who had just lost his entire family in a massive fire. He wanted to scream, flip the table, rewind time, undo the damage. But all he could do was watch the collapse sweep toward him like a tidal wave. In that moment, the conference room door burst open. A young employee rushed in, pale as a ghost. "Mr. Adams, we have another serious problem." Richard turned sharply, his voice hoarse but razor-sharp. "What now?" The employee swallowed hard. "The Federal Banking Commission has officially issued a request to open an investigation into discriminatory conduct in customer service." The entire room froze. A director gasped. "A federal investigation order already." The employee's voice shook violently. "They said the video spread too fast. They said they need to review the procedures. And the press is asking why the bank has not issued a response yet." Richard felt his mind spin. He had influence in the industry and knew people with power, but no one could stop the Federal Commission once they stepped in. And the reason they stepped in came from a heartbreaking truth. Heritage First Bank had exposed its own discrimination to millions of eyes. In the corner, David Coleman sat collapsed on the floor, clutching his head, like a frightened child abandoned in a storm. He muttered incoherently, Why I only did what was right." Someone stood and screamed straight into his face. "Right. You call insulting a client, ripping up an investment file, and throwing out one of the greatest investors in the country. Right. You destroyed our careers. You killed us." David trembled uncontrollably. He had no words left, because every accusation was true. Richard turned away. If he let emotion take over, he would kick David across the room in front of everyone. But he needed to keep what little leadership he had left, even if his authority was already in ruins. Meanwhile, in the upper floor office of Marshall Tech Innovations, Evan was still monitoring the news. He did not need to push anything, did not need to make statements, did not need to speak. The truth of the story exposed itself. The bank's own actions had ignited national outrage. A new email from Grace appeared on Evan's screen. "Evan, the media wants interviews. Every major network is waiting for your statement." Evan paused for a few seconds, then replied, "No." Grace responded immediately. "You really don't want to speak?" "Not now," Evan answered. "If I speak now, people will think I want revenge or want to brag about winning. I didn't win. I only exposed a problem that has existed far too long." Grace was silent for a moment, then sent another message. "You're scaring them." Evan looked out the window. The city remained calm, traffic flowing past, as if nothing had happened, people continuing their day, unaware that a massive bank was collapsing because of a moment of disrespect. He whispered barely above a breath, "They're not afraid of me. They're afraid of the truth." Back inside Heritage First Bank, the PR team scrambled together a draft of an official public apology. Everyone looked at Richard. He inhaled deeply, then turned on the microphone for an internal emergency broadcast. I will face the public in 10 minutes. But just as he stepped toward the door, another alert flashed across the main display. Northwest United Bank issues press release welcoming the $50 million investment from Marshall Tech. A director gasped. We really lost the $50 million. Another replied in a voice that sounded shattered. Not just lost, we handed it to our competitor. Richard froze. No tears. No anger left. Only the hollowed-out exhaustion of a man drained of everything. At that exact moment, the account management system flashed another alert. Another premier client withdraws $32 million. Withdrawal severity critical. Richard inhaled sharply, but the breath broke halfway. He gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Then he spoke, voice deep and trembling with hopeless gravity. We are officially in a market crisis. Meanwhile, at a cafe 4 blocks away, Evan received a call from an unknown number. He glanced at the screen, initially planning to ignore it, but something in his chest told him to answer. This is Evan Marshall, a trembling voice responded. Mr. Marshall, it's James Lopez, the bank employee. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, but I thought you needed to know this. Evan frowned. What is it, James? I just wanted to say. James took a shaky breath, his voice wavering but sincere. You're not alone in this. I saw what happened today. I tried to warn them. And I will testify if needed. I just want you to know that not everyone in that bank is like them. Evan fell silent. For the first time that day, his heartbeat softened. He spoke quietly. Thank you, James. One day you'll leave that place and find somewhere worthy of you. James let out a small, weary but relieved laugh. I hope so, sir. Evan ended the call and closed his eyes. In a world full of discrimination and injustice, people like James were the reason he kept fighting. But today's battle was far from over, because within 24 hours, Heritage First Bank had lost more than money. It had lost its soul. And the worst part was still looming. The customers had not learned the full truth yet, but when they did, nothing would be left to save. Light rain began to fall over Seattle as the afternoon settled in droplets, tapping gently against the glass walls of Heritage First Bank and sliding downward like tears running in reverse. But if those raindrops made the sky turn grey, then inside the tower, the atmosphere had already become suffocatingly black. Because the truth, the thing they had tried to bury beneath the polished veneer of a prestigious bank, had finally been stripped bare, leaving no place left to hide. Richard Adams stood inside the executive conference room, surrounded by screens, flashing like a swarm of panicked bees. News headlines flickered non-stop. Red alerts pulsed. Stock charts plunged. International outlets picked up the story. Calls from major clients hit the phone system so aggressively that the lines collapsed. Every vibration, every new email, every alert felt like another knife sinking into Richard's chest. A finance director slumped into a chair, arms hanging loose, his face pale and lifeless. We're losing everything. Actually losing everything. There's no saving this. Another person shouted, who leaked the security camera footage, who allowed that to happen. But the shouting died instantly when a new notification appeared on the main screen, letters flashing red like a fire alarm. Federal Commission formally opens full investigation. The entire room froze into silence. No one spoke. No one dared breathe. A young staff member stammered. They said they need full access to all customer service records from the last 5 years. 5 years, a marketing director choked out, eyes wide. But if they look at the internal data, they'll find the person next to him tugged his sleeve, signaling him to stop. But Richard had already heard it. He looked down. then slowly raised his head, his expression heavy and cold, like a man finally touching the truth he had spent years avoiding. "I know," Richard said quietly. "They will see how we really treated certain customers. They will see the numbers we ignored. And they will not forgive us." Everyone in the room understood exactly what certain customers meant. It meant people who looked like Evan. It meant those who were routinely doubted without reason. Those who were asked to provide extra documents, told to wait longer, forced to undergo additional verification, simply because they did not look like the customers the bank preferred. In the corner, David Coleman curled into himself, sobbing openly. The sound broke out of him, not from genuine remorse, but because he finally understood his life was over. Richard turned toward him. His face was no longer angry. It held something worse, bitter disappointment, like a father watching the child he trusted most destroy everything. David Richard said, his voice slow and terrifyingly calm, "This is not just because you insulted Evan. Not just because you tore up a $50 million file. It is because you represent the problem this entire bank has tried to hide for years." David trembled, his voice cracking. I didn't know." Richard cut him off with a painful roar. "Not knowing is not an excuse for discrimination. Not knowing does not make you innocent. It only makes you more dangerous." A human resources director stood, tears burning in her eyes. "We need to decide immediately. Either we terminate David or the entire bank will be seen as complicit." David scrambled to his feet, stumbling into the table. "Mr. Adams, please don't, I have a family." But before anyone could respond, pounding footsteps echoed at the door. 2 senior security officers entered, their faces hard as iron. "We have orders from headquarters. Manager David Coleman is suspended effective immediately and must leave the building." David's face drained to white, his knees nearly giving out. "No, please let me explain." But the 2 officers grabbed him by the arms and escorted him out, passing through a sea of cold, unforgiving stares. The same co-workers who once greeted him every morning, once feared him, once respected his authority, now looked at him like a stain on the floor no one wanted to step on. When the door shut behind him, not a single person felt sympathy, because everyone knew he had not only destroyed his own life, he had dragged the entire bank into the abyss with him. Richard stared at the closed door, then turned back to the room full of anxious employees. "From this moment on," he said, "we are not only facing a financial crisis, we are facing a moral crisis, and that is far harder to save than money." Outside the building, the rain fell heavier. On social media, the video of Evan's torn investment file had surpassed 20 million views. Crowds gathered in front of the bank demanding answers. Someone raised a large sign at the entrance. "Respect customers, no color bias." At the same time, Evan was on his way back to the Marshall Tech offices, watching the protesters through the car window, his heart tightening. He had never wanted innocent employees to suffer, never wanted to destroy a long-standing institution. But what he did want, what everyone deserved, was a system that treated all people fairly. When the car stopped beneath the Marshall Tech Tower, Evan received another call, this time from a high-ranking state politician. Evan, the deep, urgent voice, said the situation at Heritage First is becoming a national crisis. "We need to hear your perspective." Evan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I only want one thing," he said, voice low, firm, but carrying a deep sorrow. "A bank or any institution has no right to disrespect a human being, simply because that person does not look like the customer they expect." On the other end, the politician whispered, "Your message is going to change this entire industry." Evan didn't answer. He only watched the rain slide down the glass, each drop striking like a reminder on society's conscience. And inside Heritage First Bank, Richard looked at the fearful, exhausted, shattered faces of his employees. He understood today was not just a financial storm. It was the day an empire paid the price for its arrogance and its lack of humanity. And he understood something else. After this day, the bank would never be the same again. Because once the truth is exposed, it becomes a blade that can never be sheathed. Night fell over Seattle like a heavy black shroud wrapping around the sky. And from above, Heritage First Bank looked like a sinking ship caught in the churning ocean of crisis. The building was lit, but not with the light of life. It glowed with the frantic glare of panic, the meeting room still open, employees rushing back and forth, phones ringing non-stop, data screens burning red with warnings, the air so thick that anyone taking a deep breath might choke on it. Richard Adams stood alone at the window on the 22nd floor, looking down at the growing crowd of protesters filling the street below. Their signs raised high under the streetlights. Respect every client. No discrimination. Justice for Marshall. His voice was hoarse as he whispered, "We lost everything because of the arrogance of a few." The door behind him opened. Grace from the PR team entered with the executive secretary, both carrying a stack of papers, several hundred pages thick. "Mr. Adams, this is the preliminary damage report." Richard did not turn around, but he closed his eyes, steadying himself before speaking. "Tell me." Grace glanced at the documents, then read them aloud, like reading a death sentence. "In the past 12 hours, we lost over $1.8 billion in market value. 32% of premier client assets have been withdrawn. CTS Holding cancelled their 3-year partnership. Major investment funds are cutting ties." "What else?" Richard asked, hollow. Grace inhaled deeply. "The Federal Banking Commission has ordered an emergency audit, and they have requested all internal customer classification data from the last 5 years." Richard tilted his head, closed his eyes for several seconds, as if a knife had sliced through his chest. He knew exactly how bad that data was. Not because he personally wanted it that way, but because the truth was, the banking system had silently attached risk ratings based on countless unfair factors: skin color, clothing, customer background, the very prejudice that had led Evan Marshall to endure the humiliation of that day. In that moment of sinking realization, hurried footsteps echoed in the room. James Lopez ran in holding a freshly printed newspaper. Mr. Adams' CNN just published an independent investigation. They interviewed 4 black customers who said they experienced the same treatment at our branches. The blow hit Richard like a strike from the heavens. How long until the Department of Justice launches a full investigation? "They've requested a direct meeting," James answered quietly. "Could be tonight." Richard let go of the window ledge and turned to face James. "You were the only one who did the right thing today. I will remember that." But James didn't smile. He looked Richard straight in the eyes, his expression sad but steady. "The right thing came too late, sir." The words froze Richard in place. They were not an insult. They were simply the truth, a truth far harsher than any financial loss. Meanwhile, 10 blocks away, Evan sat in a private conference room at Marshall Tech, warm golden light casting soft shadows across his face. No phone calls, no media noise. Only him and silence. He had just finished a closed-door meeting with strategic advisors and legal counsel. Every person had told him the same thing. You just created the biggest precedent in financial history. But Evan had never sought fame, never sought praise. He wanted only one thing, that no one should ever endure what he endured today. And more importantly, what his family had endured for decades. He remembered his mother's voice the day she was interrogated for simply trying to open a children's account for him and his sister. He remembered his father being told to show extra documents because he didn't look qualified. Today was not revenge. It was a warning, a wake-up call for the entire industry. Evan stood and spoke to Grace, who was waiting outside. "We're going to the press council headquarters. I'm making a statement." Grace flinched in surprise. "Are you sure if you go public, the impact will be far bigger?" Evan nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I need to do it." 20 minutes later, Evan walked into the city's press auditorium, where more than 30 news stations had set up their cameras, bright lights flooding the podium. When he stepped up, the room fell silent. The air itself seemed to freeze. Evan looked straight into the rows of cameras, his voice clear and strong, but carrying years of quiet pain. "Today I am not speaking as a CEO. I am speaking as a human being who was treated wrongly, and who has seen a system treat far too many others wrongly. What happened at Heritage First Bank is not the story of one man. It is a question of ethics, of respect, of how we measure each other's worth." He paused, meeting the lens dead on. No one, and I repeat, no one deserves to be looked at with suspicion because of their skin color, their clothing, or where they come from. The room held its breath. Evan continued. "I am not asking Heritage First Bank to apologize to me. I am asking them to change the way they see people." A thunderous wave of applause erupted, crashing against the glass walls like the first roar of a storm of justice pouring down. When the press conference ended, social media exploded. The hashtag #RespectEveryClient hit global #1 in 40 minutes. And most importantly, people began talking about solutions, about reform, about the countless similar stories they had endured. Meanwhile, at Heritage First Bank, Richard replayed Evan's speech on a darkened office screen. He collapsed into his chair, hands over his head. He is right, and we have been wrong for far too long. A staff member ran in, panicked. Mr. Adams' Northwest United Bank just announced that thanks to Marshall Tech's $50 million investment, they grew 18% this afternoon. Richard let out a broken laugh, the kind that hurt more than tears. The $50 million Evan walked away with just built a future for another bank. He stood looking around the vast but hollow room, and he knew that tomorrow, perhaps even tonight, he would face the thing he feared most, admitting before the entire world that Heritage First Bank was wrong, and wrong on a scale too deep to repair quickly. But he also understood something even more important. The truth had been exposed. And once truth steps into the light, it never returns to the shadows. Across the city, Evan stepped out of the press building and lifted his gaze to the Seattle sky, now clearing after the rain. He knew the fight was not over. But he also knew something else today was the day everything began to shift. Not because he was a billionaire, not because he held power, but because he dared to stand up. And when one person stands up, others will rise too. That is the real power. That night, Seattle glowed with a strange kind of light, half of it from the signs of the banks, still clinging to operation, half from the phone screens of people following every update about the Evan Marshall incident. And somewhere between those two sources of light, the truth was reshaping itself. Evan left the press conference under the escort of security, but when the car door closed behind him, he did not feel safer. In fact, he felt a new weight settle on his chest, because those applauding voices were not the end. They were a summons. He knew he had opened the door for millions of people to finally speak about what they once feared to say aloud. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, inside Heritage First Bank, an opposite scene was unfolding panic, spreading like the smell of smoke in a sealed room. An emergency internal meeting was underway. 12 senior officers seated in a circle, faces exhausted, as if they had survived 3 sleepless nights. On the table lay more than 47 resignation letters submitted in just half a day, employees who could no longer bear the shame of being associated with the discrimination scandal. A deputy manager broke down, crying. How are we supposed to face the community? A long-time client just asked me to transfer their portfolio to another bank. I've never seen anything like this. The person beside her held her hand. It's not your fault, but we're all paying the price for the mistakes of a few. At the head of the table, Richard Adams didn't speak. He only stared at his trembling hands, the same hands that had signed countless major contracts now useless before the ashes his bank was turning into. He wanted to speak, wanted to lift his team's spirits, but he knew words could not save what had been lost. Suddenly the conference room doors burst open. James Lopez stepped in, holding a stack of documents, but he no longer carried the timid posture he had that morning. Now he stood straight-eyes bright, with a resolve Richard recognized instantly, the resolve of someone who no longer feared anything. James set the documents on the table. I know everyone is feeling hopeless. He began, his voice strangely calm. But I didn't come here to blame anyone. I came to propose a way out. The entire room turned toward him, and in their eyes for the first time in that horrific day, a tiny flicker of hope appeared. James took a deep breath. If Heritage First Bank wants to survive, we must rebuild everything about how we operate. We need transparency. We need to admit our wrongs. And most importantly, we must let the people who were forced to stay silent finally speak. A marketing director let out a bitter laugh. Admit we were wrong? Do you know what will happen if we do that? The stock will fall even further. Investors will abandon us. They already abandoned us, James replied without hesitation. And they left, because we stayed silent. The sentence struck the room like a slap. Richard closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. He knew this young employee was saying what he, the man in the highest position here, should have said long ago. If we wait until the chaos settles before we apologize, James continued, his voice gaining strength, we will forever be the bank that apologized too late. Richard opened his eyes. What do you propose? James slid a packet of papers toward him. A complete restructuring, anti-bias training, transparent customer onboarding protocols, a fairness checklist for service, and full protection for employees who speak up against injustice. Silence filled the room. Richard stared at the packet. It wasn't thick, maybe 20 pages, but every line felt like a needle piercing the true wound. Heritage First Bank had been asleep far too long in its own complacency. You think we still have a chance? Richard asked, voice rough. James held his gaze for a long moment, then said, our only chance is to stop thinking like a bank and start thinking like human beings. Richard let out a soft, helpless laugh, the first laugh he had managed all day. But it wasn't a joyful one. It was a laugh of someone finally facing a brutal truth. You're right, he whispered. You're young, but today, you're the only one here who remembered what we forgot. As the meeting ended, Richard's phone vibrated. He checked it, a new post from Evan. Not a victory claim, not an accusation. Just one sentence. Let's build a world where a person's worth is not measured by how they look, but by how they live. Richard exhaled slowly. That sentence wasn't a warning. It was a compass pointing toward everything a bank was supposed to stand for. And he understood the next chapter of this fight no longer belonged to Evan. It belonged to the people who remained. It belonged to those who truly wanted change. And that was what allowed Richard for the first time in this hellish day to feel like he could stand up again. Because sometimes, even in the deepest collapse, if one person still dares to rise, then hope remains. Dawn broke over Seattle with a strange kind of light stretching across the city, as if the sky itself was trying to illuminate everything that had happened the day before. Sunlight reflected off the windows of Heritage First Bank, but it was no longer the proud gleam it once carried. It looked instead like the light glinting off the roof of a house after a great fire, a light that reminded everyone that something had been burned down, leaving behind only one question: rebuild or walk away. Richard Adams stepped out of the elevator, his eyes sunken but sharply focused. His footsteps no longer trembled like they had the night before. They carried a determination that could not be taken back. In the lobby below, dozens of employees stood in a long line, not to protest, not to abandon the institution, but to wait for him. They wanted to hear what he should have said long ago. James Lopez stood at the front, holding the reform documents he had worked on through the night. When Richard approached, the entire crowd fell silent like a sanctuary awaiting its sermon. "Thank you all for being here." Richard began, his voice low but echoing like a bell cutting through the darkness. "I'll be brief. Our bank was wrong." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, then faded instantly. Richard looked at all of them, from the young receptionist to the older security guard who had witnessed Evan's humiliation to the department heads with red eyes from sleeplessness. We let arrogance and harmful habits dictate how we treated our clients. We forgot that our job is not only to manage money, but to respect people. He turned to James. "Yesterday, one employee reminded me that if we want to change, we must stop thinking like a system and start thinking like decent human beings." James bowed his head, and the others looked at him with newfound admiration. Starting today, Richard continued, Heritage First Bank will begin the largest reform in its history. Not to save our reputation, but to repair our soul. He lifted the plan James had given him. We will implement a new transparency-based service standard. We will retrain every employee. We will enforce strict consequences for any discriminatory behavior, even the smallest. And we will reopen our doors to clients who were once dismissed to prove we are worthy of the trust we lost. A small wave of applause rose, swelling into a larger one, spreading through the lobby like a breath of air breaking through suffocation. But Richard raised a hand for silence. "However," he said slowly, "there is one final thing I must do before we begin this new chapter." He inhaled deeply. "I will personally go to see Evan Marshall to offer an apology, not because we want him back, but because he deserves to hear it." The lobby fell completely silent, because that was not an apology made out of pressure. It was an apology made by a human being fully aware of his wrongdoing. Meanwhile, not far away, Evan Marshall stood in his office at Marshall Tech, gazing at a sky brightening like calm water after a storm. He had just finished a meeting with the Council for Financial Innovation, where he had been invited as an honorary speaker to discuss fairness reforms in banking. Grace entered with the morning paper in hand. On the front page, the headline read, Heritage First. Bank admits wrongdoing. Begins full-scale reform. Beside it was a photograph of Richard Adams standing among his employees, eyes steady face, tired but resolute. "Do you want to read it?" Grace asked. Evan glanced at the newspaper for a few seconds, then gently shook his head. "I don't need to read it to know what they're doing. What matters is that they started." Grace smiled. "Richard Adams wants to meet you, personally, not to negotiate." Evan slowly set his coffee down. His gaze no longer carried the cold steel of the day before. Instead, it held something steadier, wiser, and just a little warmer. "I'll meet him," Evan said. But not to talk about money or investments. He walked to the window, looking down at the city glowing beneath the morning sun. The light reflected in his eyes the light of hope, of a new beginning. "I'll meet him," he continued to tell him that change is possible in any organization that has the courage to face the truth. At Heritage First Bank, Richard received a message I agreed to meet. He closed his eyes, unable to hold back a long, trembling breath of relief, because he knew no matter how much money the bank had lost, the forgiveness of someone like Evan was not something that could be bought. It was something that could only be earned through true sincerity. As Richard stepped out of the building to go meet Evan, he found a small group of employees waiting outside. Not to protest. They were there to thank him for telling the truth. And in that brief moment, Richard understood what Evan had been trying to teach. Through both his words and his actions, justice is not revenge. Justice is change. And change today had truly begun. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and ethics within the financial sector, the story of Evan Marshall is not simply the journey of one individual standing up against discrimination. It is a powerful reminder that any system, no matter how large or how long established, can rot from within when it forgets two fundamental values: respect and transparency. The fall of Heritage First Bank didn't come from market pressure nor from competitors, but from the very moment it lost the ability to see human beings through a lens of fairness. And what makes this story truly resonate is Evan's choice. He did not destroy to seek revenge. He used his influence to force a broken system to become better. That is the essence of true leadership, someone who does not rise only for themselves, but opens a path for others to follow. If this story speaks to you, if you believe that real change begins with treating each other with humanity and kindness, then like this video to help share that message with more people, and subscribe to continue following the next journeys, where the light of justice and truth will always find a way to shine through. And comment the phrase respect to remind one another that sometimes one simple action is enough to shift an entire system.